Deep Dive Part 3. Two Land Covenants Changed History. Today, I want to bring this series of videos to its conclusion. Over the last 6 weeks, we have considered many details from the scriptural narrative found in the first 17 chapters of Bereshit or Genesis, where we have travelled from the creation of the universe through to the creation of humanity and the placement of Adam in Gan Eden, the garden of God. From there, we have looked how close and particular was the relationship between God and Adam, and how it was broken by the intervention of Satan, the adversary, who, having deceived Adam and Havah, destroyed the trust and obedience Yahweh God wanted from Avram. It's from Adam. The result of Adam having exercised his free will choice, showed that humans were not capable of having a trusting and particular relationship with Yahweh, their God. Hence, Adam and Havah were thrown out of the Garden of Eden and forbidden access to the tree of life that would have sustained them eternally. Satan, having corrupted his responsibility for the guardianship of humanity, resulted in him also being condemned by Yahweh God to be finally removed from the universe at the end of the 7,000-year rest period of the Eternal One, God the Creator. The edict issued for the demise of the adversary was decreed in the presence of all created beings, both celestial and human, as stated in Bereshit chapter 3, verse 15. Satan embarked on an unending campaign of defiance against Yahweh, whom we now know, of course, as Yeshua. Defiance of the adversary saw that all humanity was corrupted between the end of the sixth creative cycle and the flood of Noah. Only Noah was found righteous in his time. Apart from Noah and his immediate family, along with representatives of all animal kinds, Yahweh destroyed all breathing creatures so that the second phase of humanity could begin. Starting from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the human population grew in number to 70 people groups, when once again, led by the adversary, they tried to build a name for themselves so that they would not be scattered all over the world. Within just 5 generations, 70 people groups under the leadership of Nimrod built themselves the Tower of Babel near the center of the known world. It was just 5 generations from the time the flood had receded. But Yahweh God came down and confused the language, and all of them left off building the temple and could no longer communicate with each other. So they stopped building and departed to the 4 corners of the world. Just one specific region of the earth's landmass became the focal point of the battle for control between Yahweh and Satan. The disputed land was later defined in Bereshit chapter 15 verse 18 as the land from the Vadi of Egypt to the Great River Euphrates. The region is now known as the Sinai and Arabian Peninsulas. Yahweh decreed that territory would become the rightful inheritance of one man whom Yahweh would choose. Every other region of the world would become the possession of whomever claimed it. Just that one region between the Vadi of Egypt and the Great River Euphrates was claimed by Yahweh as a special set-apart territory. The reason that territory was selected by Yahweh was because he foreknew, with the passing of time and the movement of the earth's crust, the epicenter of the terrestrial landmass would become centered in his small portion of territory, which he had chosen for himself. Hence, within 5 generations from the building of the Tower of Babel, Yahweh called one man, Avram, whom he later named Avraham, meaning father of many. He took that one man to the place where he wanted his name to dwell. The land Yahweh selected was at that stage known as Canaan, which we now know, of course, as Eretz-Yisra'el. It was the territory bounded on the east side by the Yarden River and on the western side by the Mediterranean Sea. The northern boundary stretched from Sidon on the coast eastward to Mount Hermon. The southern boundary started on the Mediterranean coast at Arish, at the mouth of the Vadi of Egypt, and headed eastward to Elat at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. That territory alone became the eternal inheritance of Avraham and his descendants through Yitzchak, his son, and Yaakov, the son of Yitzchak, as an eternal promise. Just those two portions were set apart for Yahweh. Yahweh, having defined the territory he was claiming for Avraham and his descendants, brought about the necessity for two covenants that would ensure that the territory that Yahweh had chosen would remain forever the rightful possession of Avraham and his descendants. The cutting of the covenants became necessary to identify those two regions that Yahweh had set apart. Only by having the covenants being put in place would the rest of humanity know where they were permitted to live. Only those two territories specified in the covenants would be inherited by Abraham's descendants forever. In considering the two types of covenant, we see one in Bereshit chapter 15 and the other in chapter 17. And they need to be considered. We need to consider them in accordance with the legal practices that were used in the ancient Near Eastern world. The ancient Near Eastern covenant model, expressed in Bereshit, is a binding agreement and a promise which always had to be sealed with the shedding of blood. When a king conquering a nation would make a covenant with the leader of the vanquished nation, by making the latter a vassal of the conquering king. But rather than shedding human blood, the blood of animals was taken as a substitute. The covenants were symbolically sealed by cutting animals in half, laying them in two lines so that the two parties of the covenant could walk between the animal parts. If shedding the blood of the animals implied that if either party breached the terms of the covenant, the blood of that offending party would also be shed. In other words, death was the result for the offending party. That practice underscored the gravity of the commitment being made and the severity of consequences that would result if the covenant was broken. Turning now to Bereshit chapter 15, verse 17, we see it reflects a typical ancient Near Eastern style covenant that carried with it an agreement and a promise. The agreement in the covenant was made between the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch, which together passed through the animal parts. While the promise was made to Avram, who was actually in a deep sleep at the time of the cutting of the covenant, Avraham would receive the promise, but he would not be part of the agreement. Now, it is important to unpack the difference between the agreement and the promise. While the covenant in Bereshit 15:17 contains both the agreement and the promise, the recipient of the promise was not party to the agreement because it was necessary for the agreement to be multi-generational. The two parties to the agreement needed to ensure that the subsequent recipients of the promise in each generation would continue to receive the land inheritance being promised. Therefore, the two entities that passed through the animal parts, as the smoking firepot and the flaming torch, seem to imply that neither were a human king nor the leader of a vassal nation. Instead, they appear to be two celestial beings, El Shaddai and another, as only celestial beings would remain throughout the period of human history, which will take a full 7,000 years of God's creative rest period. At this point, I need to digress for a moment to explain why, from now on, throughout the rest of this Devar or talk, I will be referring to El Shaddai as being one of the parties in the cutting of the covenants. The reason I'm using the name for God as El Shaddai instead of Yahweh is because throughout the book of Bereshit, the one known as Yahweh only made himself known to the people of that time as El Shaddai, as he personally tells us in Shemot or Exodus chapter 6 verses 3 and 4, where he said, I appeared to Avraham, Yitzchak and Yaakov as El Shaddai. I did not make myself known to them by name of Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. Also with them I established my covenant to give them the land of Canaan, the land where they wandered about and lived as foreigners. Therefore, in keeping with those words, I will refer to Yahweh as El Shaddai for the rest of this Devar, where it relates to the scriptures in the book of Bereshit. However, in referencing other scriptures outside of Bereshit, I will continue to refer to Yahweh by name. Returning to the cutting of the first covenant, we see that the smoking firepot and the flaming torch were two entities that actually walked between the animal parts. So the question must be asked, who were those two parts that were concealed by those strange names or expressions? Most Christian commentators suggest that the smoking firepot or furnace somehow alludes to the time when Israel was in slavery in Egypt, with the flaming torch loosely alluding to God's word being a light shining in a dark place. The Jewish sages have also said little on this matter. Instead, they focus their attention on the surrounding verses and likely skip over verse 17. So I suggest that the significance of the wording in this verse is intending to show that the two entities were more than just an illusion of things totally disassociated with the events. Instead, I believe the reference to the smoking firepot and the flaming torch are depicting two celestial beings rather than human beings. As I have suggested in the earlier video, I believe they were El Shaddai and Satan. That may come as a shock to many people who say, how could God make a covenant with Satan? Well, I believe the answer is simple. Both had a vested interest in what was going to occur throughout the development of human history, particularly to which people groups would have the inheritance rights to the territory El Shaddai had nominated. Therefore, as celestial beings rather than earthbound humans, both El Shaddai and Satan would continue to exist right through to the end of the seventh day. Then finally, on the eighth creative day, Satan will be judged, destroyed, and removed from the universe. But until the final removal of the adversary, he will be a constant threat to the sovereign plan of God. Having said all that, I believe only El Shaddai could ensure the specific territory from the Vadi of Egypt to the Great River Euphrates would remain in the possession of Avram and his direct descendants through all generations by making a binding covenant with his opposer, the adversary. As we now know, Satan has never kept his side of the agreement. Hence, in accordance with the terms of the covenant, he will be destroyed at the end of the 7,000 years of human development. The Eternal One, Creator God, will during the final judgment bring about the demise of Satan because of his constant failure to comply not only with that covenant, but also because of the original edict signaled back in the Garden of Eden, that his ultimate demise would occur in the future. That edict was made in Bereshit chapter 3 verse 15. Hence the covenant had to be made because of the earlier promise made with Avraham in Bereshit chapter 13, and also in the earlier verses of chapter 15, where the boundaries needed to be clearly defined. In chapter 13, verses 14 through 18, following the separation of Avram and Lot upon their return from Egypt, El Shaddai told Avram all the territory that he could see from Beit El would become the inheritance of his descendants. Then again, in chapter 15, verses 1 to 6, El Shaddai appeared to Avram in a vision, saying, "Don't be afraid, Avram. I am your protector. Your reward will be very great." But Avram responded in a way that was one of bewilderment. After all, he was 86 years old and childless. However, El Shaddai reassured Avram that he would have a son, an heir from his own body, and that his descendants would go on to become as numerous as the stars in the sky. Based on those two promises, El Shaddai needed to make his covenant with another party who would remain throughout all generations of human development, which would, of course, take another 5,000 years to reach finality. The only created being who could fulfill the role as the second party of the covenant agreement was the one who would be given responsibility for oversight of large regions of the world and its population inhabiting various places. That one is the one described in Ezekiel chapter 28 verse 14, where it says, "You were a Kerev, protecting or administering a large region. I, Yahweh, placed you on God's holy mountain. You walked back and forth among the stones of fire." That being was Satan the adversary, who was described in those verses as being the king of Tyre. He alone, with other celestial sons of God, as referred to in Job chapter 38 verses 4 to 7, had been present at the time that earth was prepared for human habitation. Which is why in Ezekiel 28 verse 13 Yahweh says, "You put the seal on perfection. You were full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God." So by binding Satan into the covenant over the promised land, El Shaddai knew that when the adversary violated the covenant, he would be forced to face the consequences of his own violation. He would be totally annihilated from the universe, as we are later told in the book of Revelation. The covenant in Bereshit chapter 15, verse 17, includes the whole territory to be possessed by Avraham's descendants. But the second covenant was also needed to define separately the land of Canaan, which we now know as Eretz-Yisra'el. That territory needed to be separated from the larger territory covered by the first covenant. By cutting the second covenant, El Shaddai was confirming his own words in Bereshit 15 verses 13 to 16, which were specifically about how Israel, as Abraham's descendants, would return and take possession of Canaan, where he said, "Know this for certain, your descendants will be foreigners in the land that is not theirs. They will be slaves and held in oppression for 400 years. But I will judge that nation, the one that makes them slaves. Afterwards, they will leave with many possessions. As for you, you will join your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. Only in the 4th generation will your descendants come back here, because only then will the Amori be ripe for punishment. But why were the Amorites singled out for punishment? What set them apart from the other people groups listed in the first covenant promise? Looking back at Bereshit chapter 10, we see that the Amori were the people descended from the fourth son of Canaan. Therefore, the descendants of the Amori over the 400 years between the covenant with Avram and the return of Israel provoked El Shaddai to the point where he wanted all destroyed because of their continual idol worship. El Shaddai had been very patient, giving them plenty of time to change their ways, but they would never change. So by the time Israel returned under the leadership of Moshe, Sihon, the king of Amori, was ripe for punishment. The return of that first generation of Israel under the leadership of Moshe was the one intended to have completed the task of punishing the Amori west of the Yarden River, the same territory that Avraham had been promised in Bereshit 13 verse 17, where he was told to get up and walk through the length and breadth of the land, because I will give it to you. Returning to the cutting of that second covenant, we see how it was different from the first. The second covenant was cut directly between El Shaddai and Avram, who had by that stage been renamed Avraham. That latter covenant was ratified by the shedding of Abraham's own blood through the act of circumcision. Hence we're told in Bereshit chapter 17 verses 1 and 2, when Avram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Avram and said to him, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Walk in my presence and be pure-hearted. I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will increase your numbers greatly. It was at that stage that El Shaddai changed his name from Avram to Avraham. Because I have made you the father of many nations. Then El Shaddai concluded his promise in verse 8, I will give you and your descendants after you the land in which you are now foreigners, all the land of Canaan as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. But why was that second covenant necessary when El Shaddai had already promised the territory rights to Avram in the first covenant? The difference was that through the second covenant, El Shaddai separated the land of Canaan from all that had been promised in the first covenant. The inheritance of the land in the first covenant became the possession of the descendants of Ishmael, Avram's firstborn, along with the descendants of Abraham's other 6 sons born from Keturah, his second wife, whom he married after Sarah died. But the land of Canaan, which we now know as Eretz-Yisra'el, was always to be exclusively for the descendants of Yitzchak, Avram's second son. He became the child of the unique promise El Shaddai made to Avram when he was 99 years old. Yitzchak was born through Sarah when she was 90 years old. His birth was truly a miracle. So the important difference between the two covenants in Bereshit 15:17 and 17:7 is that the latter paved the way for the particularly close relationship between El Shaddai and Avraham through the shedding of Abraham's own blood by the way of circumcision. It also put the adversary on notice that one small portion of land west of the Yarden River was forever to be the inheritance of the people who would descend from Abraham through Yitzchak and Yaakov. As for the descendants of Ishmael, Yahweh acknowledged that he was Abraham's firstborn, and as such had fathered 12 sons. He also became a great nation in his own right. Through the first covenant, Ishmael was given the whole region from the Vadi of Egypt to the Great River Euphrates, apart from that small portion given to Yitzchak through the second covenant. However, the greater part of the region that Ishmael had been given was also shared with Avram's other 6 sons through Keturah. Alongside them also the descendants of Esau, the twin brother of Yaakov, and his descendants. Hence, when over 400 years later the first generation of Israel arrived in Kadesh Barnea, and the 12 leaders were sent to reconnoiter the land, they encountered 7 people groups that had descended from Canaan, just as Avraham had been told. As we know from the narrative in the book of Numbers, the 10 bad reports about the people groups in Canaan resulted in the first generation of Israel being forbidden to enter the land. Rather, all those over 20 years and older died in the wilderness. The adversary, having tried to thwart the plan of Yahweh, placed his chosen people in the midst of that land. But the second generation of Israel, under the leadership of Yehoshua, were finally taken across the Yarden River into the land of Canaan. As we say, the rest is history. Battles continued throughout the time Israel dwelt in Eretz-Yisra'el, until finally, because of their own errant ways, Yahweh finally took the 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes, into a prolonged exile, and later the remaining 2 tribes into the 70-year exile in Babylon. So turning back to the 2 covenants, we hear relatively little about the descendants of Ishmael and Esau, along with the descendants of Abraham's 6 sons by Keturah, until the modern state of Israel was established in 1948. As we have seen from the first 2 parts of this deep dive series, those various factions lived in relative harmony together in various parts of the Middle East, without any consideration being taken for Eretz-Yisra'el until the Arab-Israeli War of 1948-49. As I discussed in the last 2 episodes, the so-called Palestinians and the 3 ancient nations of Moab, Ammon, and Esau suddenly became an ever-increasing threat to this newly formed state of Israel. During the last 57 years, since the Six-Day War of 1967, there has been a continuous uprising of anti-Semitism that to a large extent has been fueled by the nations of the West through the United Nations and its support organizations. The tensions throughout the Middle East, and particularly since the 7th of October 2023, have increased at an unprecedented rate. All that brings us to the point where we are now ready to take a deep dive into both the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel to gain a better appreciation of what is likely to occur in the near future. We have reached a point in history where many prophecies from Daniel and Revelation are being fulfilled. We are seeing an awakening of the silent people groups who, throughout most of history, since the 2 covenants had, until recently, have had little or no impact upon Israel. But in the not too distant future, there will be a more rapid change similar to what has occurred in the last month in Syria. So in the latter part of January, I want to begin a new series that will center on the books of Daniel and Revelation, with a particular focus on how the narrative in Revelation has been playing out in the world scene more strongly than ever since 2017. So until we begin again with a new series, I wish you all a happy Hanukkah celebration. And for those subscribers in New Zealand and Australia, may you have a well-deserved summer break. And for those who are in the Northern Hemisphere, I pray that you may have a peaceful midwinter break. Shabbat Shalom.